Good morning, everyone who's present for the summit today. We are on the day 2 of the Inclusive Finance India Summit. And in Hall B, we have the track Digital Financial Inclusion, the Need to Tread Responsibly. This is the second technical session for the day, and we will deal with the topic of digital financial services and data protection, balancing innovation with safeguards. And this session is being co-curated with LEAD at Kriya University. It is my pleasure to invite the panel of speakers for the session. The session will be moderated by Sharon Buter. Sharon Buter is Executive Director, Lead at Kriya University. And the panelists for the day include Jayashree Venkatesan, Director, Responsible Finance and Customer Protection, CFI. Indradeep Ghosh, Executive Director, Dwala Research. Shubhashish Badra, Principal, Privacy Tech, Omidyar Network. And Ghiyasuddin Mohammed, Senior Policy Manager, Digital Financial Services, Alliance for Financial Inclusion. Sharon, we will be playing the video, a short video of Voices from the Field now. After the video, I'll request you to take over the conversation.
Okay, great.
Team, if you could please play the video.
क्या है जो आता हुआ अच्छा लगता है लेकिन जाता हुआ नहीं?
एक और हिंट, ये चीज जाती है हर महीने पर आती है 3 महीने में एक बार।
ब्याज, इंटरेस्ट।
लोन पे तो इंटरेस्ट बैंक हर महीने लेते हैं,
लेकिन सेविंग्स अकाउंट में इंटरेस्ट देते हैं 3 महीने में एक बार।
ऐसा क्यों?
एयू बैंक के सेविंग्स अकाउंट में इंटरेस्ट मिलता है हर महीने,
मतलब साल में 12 बार।
एयू बैंक, बदलाव हमसे है।
Presenting 2 new tech initiatives in the retail microfinance sector. Sahyog 2.0 app to ensure data security and efficient services with newly added features like eKYC, geo-tagging and instant credit verification. And cashless payments of EMI via any bank UPI for easy and safe transactions. All this with an aim to enhance last mile efficiency and delivery for the microfinance entrepreneurs.
जिंदगी के कई मौसम अनुभव किया मैंने। हालात बदले, लोग बदले, अगर कुछ नहीं बदला तो बाबूजी की सिखाई हुई एक बात, वो कहते थे जब नींव मजबूत हो तो फिर चाहे वक्त के उतार चढ़ाव कैसे।
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to moderate a really interesting panel today on digital financial services, data protection, balancing innovation with safeguards. I think this is a really relevant topic. I think everybody knows, and it's always daunting to pack in 90 minutes such a really complex sort of like issue, but really important. So we hope today that you can gain some insights. We have a really fabulous panel members. Just to give an insight on sort of like the topic, I think we all know that technology has really turned around sort of like financial inclusion services on its head, the traditional format. It brought in novel business models, ease of assessment, solving those identification problems, credit versus solve problems has been much easier, as well as, increased access to financial services, in particular to underserved segments, such as, the low-income household, migrants, individuals, and in particular, women, as well as the tiny and nano enterprise segment who have been credit scarred. And we all know that they really form sort of like the fabric of a lot of the MSME growth ecosystem as well. So along with digital services, one cannot talk about, these novel innovations without even introducing, the huge potential of datafication of the world, in a sense, no? So I think that leaves a lot of huge potential, but also leaves a lot of huge risk, as we know. So some of them we're all aware about, data theft and as well breaches. Another aspect that is quite crucial, given the heterogeneity of India and people having several complex issues into one, is the huge worry risk of revealing identities that perhaps should not be revealed online, that could cause further problems to people, and do the reverse effect. So, for example, the religious, political identities being more aware, sexual identities being revealed when they should not be, etc. The government has also made efforts, in a sense, to try to address these. This is emerging, but there's still a lack of privacy regulatory framework, in particular for these marginalized segments, that could further expose them. One can even think that, based on some digital data, some people might be further excluded, given the information that people rely on they might be denied services that should have access to. And I don't think that's undoing of anybody. I think that's just a result of some of the aspects that we need to look into when we talk about safeguard. We also need to understand as well, how people will use this data. This segment in particular, they are not well educated often. They're not well aware. They might not be curious, or even if they're curious, their need to have access to finance and other aspects probably outweigh the potential risk that they're exposing them to. So in a sense, it's quite important to understand that in the willingness to want to increase access and utilize this huge data, that we don't further erode trust in the digital financial inclusion system, and we don't further erode gains that have been done with other initial financial inclusion methods. Within that poses a lot of question. I think data is a very interesting topic in a sense, and although this is a panel on finance, one can see that the financial lenders and other related in terms of benefits and all, they have been using the whole, I would say, messiness of the digital world. People's life has been put online and almost up for grabs to see. I also, in terms of looking at alternative credit score, people might be thinking, can we use location? Can we use how many times people access other things? Can we use how people use social media, etc.? So that prompts a lot of questions on understanding, how do people think through the utilization of the safeguard, and how people think through their exposure. There's an initial study by Decoris that looked at, how people have, what is their data philosophy across their digital portfolio. And one of the things that emerges, it is not a one-size-fits-all. Actually, people have different perceptions, and even in the low-income segment, of how they're comfortable about exposing their data, depending on, the digital aspect of it. They might have a different philosophy of sharing their entertainment data versus their financial data. The government as well has started to look as well, sort of be on the road to see, how can we look more into this. It started as well in August 23rd, 2017, when the Supreme Court has recognized the privacy as a fundamental right. Further, personal data protection bill has been drafted, but is still pending discussion and enactment in the parliament. And really recently, the RBI has mandated as of January 1st, 2002, that no merchant can store data of the customers on its system. They need to either ask for informed consent or have data cards tokenized to make sure that they're not building huge data sets. So this also has further implications for innovations that can be used, for example, with online digital payments, or even the hope we had. So today, I'm very pleased to really hear insights from really an excellent, fantastic panel to understand how can we create an ethical and data-engaged world, balancing data innovation and safeguard. So without further ado, I think Mahesh already presented initially the teams. I'll just go through the bios individually, and they're so prestigious, everybody. So I'll just read a little bit more about what they do. So Indradip is executive director of Vara Research. He works with the board to drive its research agenda and leads research priority in coordination with the practice head. Indradip holds a PhD in economics from MIT and MA from Cambridge University. And he brings an interdisciplinary research orientation to understand and solve problems of financial inclusion and social protection. As well, Indradip's team work really in real life situations, working with people on the ground, and has a great insights of how to create these solution-driven research agenda that will drive the impact people aspire to. We have Jayshree, who leads research on fintech platforms and other digital financial service providers to understand incentive practice and how they serve low-income consumers. Jayshree joins CFI after working for 8 years as an independent global consultant to several partners, including CGAP, World Bank, etc. Jayshree is a senior fellowship fellow at the Lear Institute House within the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. In 2014, Jayshree was awarded the Chevening Fellowship for Leadership by the Foreign and Government Office, UK. We have Giyas Mohammed, who's Senior Policy Manager, DFS, Alliance for Financial Inclusion. He leads the Digital Financial Services and FinTech Walk at Alliance for Financial Inclusion. This entails providing peer learning, technical assistant, advisory service to central banks and financial regulators in leveraging digital finance and FinTech to advance financial inclusion. He has more than 12 years of work in DFS and financial inclusion advisory service. He has worked with various projects with regulators, government institutions, banks, mobile networks, etc. And lastly, we have Shubhashish Badra, who is Principal Privacy Tech at Omidyar Network. He is responsible for sourcing, evaluating, and managing investment in digital identity. He joined Omidyar Network India from the global management consultant firm McKinsey, where he worked in the Delhi office for 2 years. He's a Rhodes Scholar. Shubhashish has an MPhil in economics from Oxford University and a BA in economics from St. Stephen's College, Delhi. So without further ado, I will pass on the baton to my first panel speaker, Dr. Indrajit. Dr. Indrajit, so can you tell us a little bit more about the landscape of digital financial inclusion and your thoughts on this wide range topic as well? On to you, Imran.
Okay, hi. Thanks, Sharon. So, hi everybody, and good to be part of this distinguished panel. Sharon, let me just start by giving a very, very brief history of digital finance in India. Really, the history goes back to the mid-1980s. The RBI set up a committee to look at mechanization of the banking system and the digitization of India's payment and settlement system. So really begins with the Rangarajan Committee, 1984. So the digitization of India's payment and settlement systems really begins with that committee's work. And then it slowly begins to pick up steam in the 1990s. And then really it is in the last 2 decades that much of the progress and advances that we see today have occurred. So things like the electronic clearing services, the real-time gross settlement, the RTGS system, the NEFT, National Electronic Fund Transfer System, the ATM card networks, all of this really comes into place in the first and second decades of the new millennium. And all of these technological developments have been supported by the development of regulatory frameworks, which are intended to make digital payments safer, more credible, etc. So, for instance, the RBI has authorized payment system providers like the NPCI, and that has led to the development of many retail payment systems, such as the Immediate Payment System, IMPS, the Unified Payment Infrastructure, UPI, Aadhaar-enabled payment system, AEPS, etc. Now, in the last decade, some of the key developments have been, you mentioned the right to privacy judgment, which was very important, which recognized the right to privacy as a fundamental right. And this was necessary because in the digital domain, privacy concerns are indeed of a different kind, of a different order of magnitude significance relative to the offline world. The emergence of public digital infrastructure for payments and settlements, such as the India Stack API, has also been an important development in the last decade. Another phenomenon which we have witnessed is the platformization of financial services and the rise of digital platforms, not just in finance, but in e-commerce as well. But these platforms tend to operate across different domains, so where finance is kind of embedded within commerce value chains as well. Then there has been the creation of account aggregators, which provide data pipelines for transferring data from one financial entity to another, and all around greater use of technology across financial products and processes for all the different stages of delivering financial services, from origination to underwriting to repayments to settlement to managing customer relations and to providing redress. And finally, in the last 5 or 6 years, there has been also a growth in digital currencies with very, very high investments in cryptocurrency in India, and also the central bank now talking about developing central bank, its own central bank digital currency. So overall, I would say that that's the landscape. I would say that even though digital financial services have advanced significantly in the last 10 to 15 years in India, the problem of including rural populations and low-income households within the fold of the digital financial services domain remains. And this problem remains because there are multiple challenges that are still to be overcome in the uptake of digital financial services. So there are technical and infrastructural barriers to be overcome, such as low bank account access, high rates of dormancy of bank accounts, poor internet and electricity availability in many parts of the country, lack of access to smartphones, etc. There are demographic barriers, for instance, like linguistic barriers, literacy and digital literacy barriers. Then there are economic barriers. So upfront, the investments required for ICT devices are very, very large. There is also fraud, transaction failures, etc., which impose their own kinds of economic costs. And finally, new public access points such as CSCs, although these kinds of public access points have become widespread in India today, they still suffer from problems. For instance, they are not necessarily economically viable. There is a lot of rent-seeking behavior at the last mile, etc. There are cultural barriers. So exclusion from digital services is tied to exclusion in other aspects of life due to gender, caste, religion, economic status, etc. And so all of this also is the context, provides the context for understanding why low-income households and new to digital financial services users typically do not have a lot of trust in DFS, and they tend to bring to their encounter with digital financial services as kind of anxiety or fear of being defrauded, of being caused harm, etc. Now, we should also understand that while privacy concerns are very, very important across the board for all consumers of digital financial services, including you and me, it is, even low-income households do have privacy concerns. Dwara has recently concluded a wide-ranging survey of low-income households to understand their attitudes towards their own privacy. And we find that poor and low-income households have very sophisticated understanding of their own data privacy. And so privacy and data protection remain vital areas of concern for the regulator and for financial service providers. And these, there's a wide range of data protection concerns, from concerns with the use of the misuse of personal data, and concerns around the breach of personal data. So I think that even though digital financial services have made significant progress in India over the last 10 to 15 years, there are still a lot of challenges, especially for low-income households, to bring them into the fold of digital financial services that have to do both with contextual barriers as well as barriers that have to do with creating trust and the adequate amount of ease with which low-income households can be onboarded onto this journey. So, I can of course go into much more detail as to what kinds of risks exist, for instance, on the data protection front and the data use front, and what providers should be doing in order to meet those challenges. But I'm going to stop here, Sharon, and hand it back to you. Maybe I can come back to that later.
Thanks a lot, Indra. This is a great start to it. One thing I forgot to mention is that we'll ask questions at the end, and we welcome questions on the chat. So I'm collecting questions from the people, and at the end we can have a series of questions. I have already highlighted a few for you in Reddit. And great, after the others have discussed, that we can get back to some of your points, I think, because today we'll have a wide spectrum and the conversation will complement each other, free flowing. I would have a good question for you, but I'll wait at the end to ask you. So without further ado, I would go to the video that we were supposed to play. So it'd be great. Can we have the video right now before we get into our second panelist, Jayshree, who will discuss on low-income segments and data protection.
Thank you, Sharon.
होती है छोटी छोटी सी ऑनलाइन पेमेंट वगैरह में, जैसे कि कभी कभी कस्टमर आता है, हमारा पैसा फंस जाता है, तो उस पैसे के लिए हमें उन्हें वेट कराना पड़ता है कि भैया आप रुक जाइए, हमारे पास पेमेंट नहीं आया है। तो कुछ तो ऐसे होते हैं जो रुकते हैं हमारे पास, लेकिन कुछ होते हैं मैंने पेमेंट कर दिया है, टिक हो गया है, बट अब मैं नहीं रुक पाऊंगा, मुझे और भी काम है। तो ऐसी छोटी छोटी प्रॉब्लम्स हम लोगों को पर डे फेस करनी पड़ती हैं। कभी कभी ऐसा होता है कि कोई आता है कस्टमर हमारे पास, हम लोगों से उधार लेकर जाता है, हम लोग देते हैं, उसके बाद फिर आता है, नहीं देने आता है, हमें काफ़ी अपना ही पैसा उन लोगों से काफ़ी मांगने के लिए बहुत ज़्यादा दिक्कतें फेस करनी पड़ती हैं।
Sharon, you're live now.
Great. Is the video playing?
It's over.
So okay, great, sorry. I was writing notes. Sorry about that. So thank you a lot, Mayush. Out to Jayshree, looking forward to hear your experience and your wide perspective, because I know your background has been immense across the whole spectrum of digital finance as well. So on to you, Jayshree. Yeah, great.
Thanks, Sharon. It's a bit daunting to follow Indradeep's, really succinct overview of the digital financial landscape. I'm going to focus actually on the last 18 months and what that has done to accessing financial services, because I think as a result of the pandemic, digital and financial services have become so intertwined. It's hard to separate the two, even for people that are at the base of the pyramid or who earlier we thought were hard to reach. So G2P, for instance, has accelerated that across the world. You asked me to speak about vulnerability. I think vulnerability is complex, just like poverty, and it has so many factors that influence it. And it's dynamic, just like poverty. So it keeps changing. And who is vulnerable changes. And like you pointed out in your starting remarks, that identities itself can create a new set of vulnerabilities that traditional financial services probably had to a large extent, but now we see it at scale as a result of digital financial services. So, what are, and if you pointed out to some of these vulnerabilities early on. So digital financial services, because they're delivered digitally, exacerbate vulnerability by being exclusionary. So what happens to people who lack the ability to transact digitally, who live in areas with poor infrastructure, or in societies where the norms prevent, access to digital channels. So patriarchal societies, for instance. We see newer risks, and you spoke about some of these in your introductory remarks, Sharon, about the risks of fraud, identity theft, data risks. But then a lot of it is also because of poorly designed systems. So when we've designed, or when we think about the digital world, in a lot of cases, we've taken the traditional world and translated it into the digital world. We haven't thought about redefining or reimagining redressal mechanisms. We haven't thought about how can we make that easier for consumers to access. And I know that Dwara Research and CGAP have done a lot of work on this, and they call it. A lot of these are the outcomes of what we call modularization of financial systems, where the delivery of financial services is taking place through multiple financial service providers, and consumers, as a result, are facing poor experiences at each point of handover. And then finally, we're talking about what is the data that's going into these systems, right? We're talking about biases that creep in, and we have any number of biases that can creep in based on the data trails that consumers have or don't have. So for example, what happens when financial service providers are taking data from a phone to assess, eligibility of a consumer who then lives in a multi-generational household where she's possibly sharing her phone with other family members. So besides the, privacy angle here, what is the story that the data trail is really telling the provider, and is that accurate? Or imagine you're a refugee that has no national ID, and you've paid a local to register a SIM in the country that you live in, and now that local or that person has been flagged for fraud, and having too many SIMs, and your account is frozen as a result, and you don't have access to financial services as a result. So a lot of this has been covered. I think at CFI, my colleague Alex has been talking about algorithmic biases and how some of these vulnerabilities get exacerbated as a result of data biases. And CGAP has been doing a lot of work on the redressal mechanisms. There's a whole piece of work that's been done on analyzing social media, where we realized that consumers were taking to social media in order to complain because traditional complaint mechanisms were just not available. And while that may not be comprehensive or representative of the entire population, because not everyone complains, but it does provide early signals about what might be going wrong in the delivery of financial services in the digital world. So I'm going to pause in case you have want me to talk a little more. I'm happy to.
No, that's wonderful, Jayashree. I think let's keep this on from discussion. I think you provided already a wide range of the topic, and we can go forward with Gyas, and after that I'll get back to you. I wanted a first round, and we can see how what emerges, and we have a few questions that I'm starting to do, so I'll come back with the query sessions to all of you after. And I invite all of the panelists to, even if you have a question to each other, or even you want to add after someone has discussed, because sometimes insights come when other people discuss, feel free. I think let this be something emerge. Like I mentioned, it's a very complex topic, and we have a rich spectrum of various points of view and experience here. So let's take advantage of that. So thanks a lot, Jayashree. Very interesting. I'll go forward with Gyas, who I believe you have a presentation for us today from your work at Alliance for Financial Inclusion. Please go ahead. You can upload it simply.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sharon, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this session. It's really an honor to be amidst this excellent set of speakers. Also, since I'm based in Malaysia, it feels like I'm back home, although virtually. It feels like playing cricket in my home ground, although I'm not very good at playing cricket, I should confess. So I'll use a presentation. So I represent Alliance for Financial Inclusion. We are a network of central banks and financial supervisors across emerging market economies, and we focus primarily on financial inclusion policies. So the network has come up with a policy framework on data privacy for digital financial services. And maybe in the next 10 minutes, I'll go through the presentation. So let me share this. So at Alliance of Financial Inclusion, we have working groups. I manage.
Yes, do you want to put it in presentation?
Yeah. We have various working groups under the financial inclusion thematic, and I manage and coordinate the digital financial services working group. So we have about 60 member countries who are part of the working group, and this specific work was led by the Superintendency for Banking of Peru, and we had about 16 member countries who are part of this policy framework that we developed. Before starting, I just wanted to play a quick video to provide a good context to the discussion that we are having.
Recipes for cookies. Cookies.com.
Cookies.com values your privacy.
Okay.
Okay isn't an option.
I just want to make cookies.
Your options are learn more, manage preferences, accept and save, accept but don't save, agree and save but don't accept, agree and exit, disagree and exit, disagree but only partly exit while saving some preferences you haven't managed to accept.
Learn more.
Cookies are a way for us to analyze your data so it can be shared with third parties and also around Hard Biscuit.
Who are the third parties?
250 subsidiaries of the Russian government.
Decline.
You can't decline that.
Why?
Well, then we won't be able to analyze your data.
But I don't want you to.
We have to a bit.
Why?
So we can serve you relevant adverts like this and this And this,
Quite interested in the large French horn.
while selling that data to third parties.
Oh, no, decline.
I thought you wanted the horn.
Okay, you know what? I just want to decline everything except the strictly necessary cookies.
You also can't decline the mandatory cookies, the compulsory cookies, or the cookies of great mystery.
What do they do? No, I want to decline everything that's declinable.
Done.
Thank you.
Accept all and save?
Yes. No! What does accept all mean?
Accept all.
But I told you to decline some of them.
There was also save and exit, which would have saved what you'd previously done.
Can I go back and change it?
Yes, but I can't tell you how.
Why not?
Because then you do it.
You know what? I don't care. Spy on me. I just want to bake a cookie.
Thank you for your preferences.
You're welcome. Recipe.
Thank you for taking time. I think this video provides a very clear context, although from the broader internet on the use of data in delivery of various services. And in this context, we are talking about the use and the extent of data that is used in offering digital financial services. And as a network, we've focused more on data privacy given its immediate relevance to the consumer. I'll not go into the details of how we have defined so on and so forth. At the end of the presentation, I'll provide a link to the policy framework for everyone's reference. Again, obvious things here, benefits of data processing and especially from an emerging market and digital financial services perspective, innovations such as open finance, open banking help both in terms of increasing access to wide variety of value-added financial services, but also increase the quality of the financial services being offered by providing various non-financial services. This could be financial management tools, so on and so forth. And we've also seen how data can be used as an effective, AML and CFT tool, identification tool, so on and so forth. So there are obvious benefits of processing data for customers and providers of financial services. Of course, there are risks, and my other esteemed panelists alluded to some of those risks, so I'll not go into the details. But a couple of things to kind of make note of, and this stems from the video also that I played. Often, in the current scenario, there is currently a disproportionate use of data and benefit from the use of data on the part of the providers. So the idea is to make this mutually beneficial, and also issues such as automated decision making, profiling, so on and so forth, may lead to further exclusion of vulnerable population. Jayashree alluded to it already. Traditionally, we have seen women, elderly, and other vulnerable segments do not have the digital trail for them to be able to avail further products and services through digital channels. This may lead to further exclusion, which is a big risk from a financial inclusion standpoint. And there are other risks also that I've highlighted in the slide here. In the interest of time, let me proceed. So if you look at a global perspective of where we stand with respect to data privacy and protection related regulations, this data from UNCTAD talks about 66 countries within its network having some form of legislation around data privacy and protection. 22% of the countries, largely among emerging market economies, do not have any regulation related to data protection and privacy. And more importantly, the existing data protection frameworks do not reflect the realities that we see within the financial services space. That's a more important point to note, right? So that's where the working group also came in and kind of looked at data protection and privacy from a financial inclusion angle and also digital financial services angle. So in the next 4 or 5 slides, I'll talk about the key contours of the pillars of the policy framework on data privacy for digital financial services that AFI has developed. First is, looking inward and kind of seeing if there are any existing legislations or regulatory frameworks around data privacy, specifically from a financial services framework, and if not, starting with the establishment of an overarching policy and regulatory principles. Of course, this could be beyond the remit of a central banker or a financial supervisor, but they being a core part of the digital financial services ecosystem, it's very important for them to advocate for such a legislative framework at a national level, actually, and then kind of bring it to the financial services space. The second is around data controller and processor obligations. So again, without getting into the nitty-gritties, the idea is for the companies who process the data, who control the data, for them to have certain obligations in place, actually. So this again, there should not be blanket regulations or requirements in nature. They should be proportionate to the extent and sensitivity of the data that they are using. So having internal governance arrangements, doing data impact assessments, establishing data processing principles, and restricting access to data within the establishment or the organization in itself. And we've seen most of the reasons or the causes for a data breach is because of lapse of internal controls and access rights to various employees within the organization, actually. So having those principles and processes in place is really very important. And of course, issues related to providing information of data breach to the regulator and the wider ecosystem is also something that this pillar talks about. Then we talk about the data subject rights. Again, may sound very imperialistic, but here we are talking about the consumer rights, actually. So establishing fundamental rights of the consumers. This could be related to right to accessing the information about them that a bank or a financial services provider might have, and right to use the data and port it to other players in the ecosystem, right to modification or rectification of that data, right to remain anonymous, so on and so forth, is what this pillar talks about. And again, this is in the interest of making it mutually beneficial in terms of access and use of data, both for the consumer and for the other key players in the financial services value chain, actually. The next pillar talks about the consumer awareness and recourse component. Again, the video that I showed earlier in the presentation talks clearly to this pillar, actually. So you may have various policies related to privacy, accessing and usage of consumer data and all. What is more important is to have a system which is easily able to communicate in an easily understandable manner to the consumers who are giving their important data to you to process, actually. Beyond awareness, having recourse mechanisms. If a consumer wants to take back the data, right to be forgotten, and use the data and share it with other players in the ecosystem, that should be able to do. And if there's any grievance that they have, the providers of financial services should have a mechanism to address their grievances. This is, in my opinion, one of the most important components when it comes to the regulatory aspects of data protection and privacy. Often we have regulations in place, but there are no mechanisms, approaches, and tools to supervise them, and there's no teeth for enforcement actually amongst many of the regulators and supervisors. So this pillar talks about taking a risk-based and proportionate approach to supervision. So this could be in terms of developing data risk assessment methodologies and tools, and once the usage of subtech tools for assessing the risk as well as supervising the regulated entities, and more importantly having enforcement power actually, and this again has to work in coordination with other regulators in the ecosystem. So we are talking about data protection authorities, and in many jurisdictions mobiles, smartphones or feature phones play a major role. So working in coordination with the telecom regulators, competition authorities in enforcing the data protection requirements or regulations within the licensed entities is something this pillar talks about. Finally, and this is very important within the ongoing context of the global emergency that we are seeing, and many of the governments have indeed leveraged the consumers' data to provide them with various benefits in the event of an emergency actually. So but there have been instances, or there could be instances of governments or broader entities abusing consumers' data in the event of a global or a national emergency. So we need to have clear rules for access to data, which could be time bound and event bound. And once the event is through, we will need to go back to the original outlines of the legal framework actually. Finally, this is for many of the countries that do not have any regulatory or a legal framework around data protection actually. How should a supervisor or a regulator go about bringing in data privacy and protection related rules when there are no legal frameworks in place actually? So starting with high level assessment in terms of how the market is, how mature the market is, to what extent data is being used by the fintechs and digital financial services providers, and the related data privacy risks. Next is in terms of taking a very consultative approach towards establishing these rules in terms of engaging with various stakeholders. This could be consumers themselves, consumer groups, fintech providers, financial services providers, engaging with them, and also legal entities engaging with them, taking their inputs and then coming up with rules. Again, without going into the details, one key point that we also talk about in this minimalist approach is taking a proportionate approach. And just to give an example, a super app with more than 300 million consumers and a startup which has less than 5,000 consumers should not have the same set of penalties, the same set of obligations. So to say, it should be proportionate in terms of the extent of the consumer data being used and processed, and the sensitivity and confidentiality of the data that is being used. So requirements related to conducting data audits or having a data protection officer or penalties, so on and so forth, should be proportionate to the size of the entity as well as the extent of the data and the confidentiality or sensitivity of the data that is being used actually. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation. I have provided a link to the guideline note for the participants to make note of. And with that, over to you, Sharon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Yas. It's very interesting. I think you pointed out on like key aspects, and I have a lot of questions for you after. I think you touched upon important issues and important things to resolve and how to go forward. I think action points are important. So lastly, I'll go to Subhashish, who will articulate some aspects on the Umidiyar network work that he's been doing, and also maybe even comment on some of the previous panelists in relation to some of the work that they have been doing as well. Over to you, Subhashish.
Excellent. Thank you, Sharon. I will share my screen as well and walk through a brief presentation. So before I get started, just a couple of minutes on Umidiyar Network India itself. So we are a impact fund which invests in entrepreneurs, both for-profit and not-for-profit, who are helping create a meaningful life for every Indian. And the lens we take is around good tech, which to us has two components. One is tech for good, which is you use technology for better financial inclusion, education, etc. But it has to be balanced with what we call responsible tech, which is that the users of technology in those sectors have to follow responsible practices, and data protection being one of those. So with that in mind, one of the verticals that we build out at Umidiyar Network India is called Digital Society, and that looks at how do you improve consumer protection and data protection, privacy, and better use of technology in all the other sectors that we work in. So a lot of what I'm going to walk through will be some of our reflections and some of our thoughts in this area. And let me kind of go through that somewhat sequentially. So at the highest level, as an organization, I think what we are fairly cognizant of is that the Indian digitization story is actually quite rapid. And I think some of these statistics are quite stark, the number of people who access the internet, most of them being through smartphones, who probably use a handful of apps, unlike more sophisticated users who might have kind of first come on board through broadband lines or laptops or stuff like that. Indians being the largest consumers of data anywhere in the world, 13.8 GB per month. That means there's a great datafication going on. And of the people who are online, about 500 million of them would have come online between 2017 and 2022, which is what we call the next $500 million. So it is it's something that's really, the internet and digitization is something that's really exploding in many parts of India. But at the same time, it is leading to many risks. Financial frauds is one of them, and I think basically the focus of today's discussion and the amount that banks are losing, the amount of cyber frauds that are happening. There's risks of identity thefts that are coming up. There's unconsented data monetization that's happening. There are personal data leaks happening. Both we've had many large cases, Domino's, Big Basket, Air India, etc., including in the kind of financial services space. But what is the impact that all of this is having on individuals is that their trust in a way has been broken. About 40% of individuals in India say that they do not trust government or private players with their data. Now, different segments in India are affected by these challenges very differently. So the way these challenges affect the rich and middle income will be probably very different from what we call the aspirers, the vegetable vendors, the garment factory workers, the domestic helps, and their experience of privacy, their expectations, and the way they navigate privacy also might be very different. So what does that mean when we talk about data privacy? I think one of the reflections we've had that a one-size-fits-all data protection or privacy regime is a limiting frame. And where we draw a lot of kind of conceptual inspiration from is this work by Dr. Anya Kovacs, who's the founder of the Internet Democracy Project. And she posits privacy as boundary management, that just like we choose in real life who to share what parts of our life with, we should be equipped to do so even when we are in an online sphere, and we should therefore privacy like a home is something that we should decide who to share with, for what reason, and this is a super dynamic concept. So I think that's important to keep in mind, which is how do we get to this vision of privacy rather than a vision of privacy which says here are your laws and here are your rights and everyone has the same laws and everyone gets the same protection and all of that. And as we think about how do we operationalize this whole notion of boundary management, I think there are three aspects. The legal rights the legal rights, which we are all relatively aware of, and Gyas has kind of spoken about it in fair amount of detail, but where we as Omidyar Network focus a lot on is the better design aspect of it and the tech tools. And I will get to all three of these fairly quickly. So firstly, the legal rights, because I think this is something all of us are fairly familiar with. And these are 8 rights that are usually spoken about in the data protection discourse. Some of these available in the Indian Personal Data Protection Bill, some of those not, some of them not. So right to be informed of how your data has been collected, the right to access that data that has been collected, the right to be forgotten, the right to move your data, etc. So now these are all enshrined in a set of laws that are being rolled out across the globe. And over time, I'm sure there will be innovation on how do businesses actually operationalize these rights at a low cost. So we are also investing in a number of companies, innovations, etc., that can make this translation of a legal right into a day-to-day reality happen. But I'll keep that out of the scope of this presentation and actually move on to the second thing, which I think is far more actionable even today, which is the design aspect of it. Now, the central part of all these data protection regulations is consent. But as all of us who probably ever tried to read a privacy policy know, is that consent in India or anywhere in the globe is broken by default. A 2018 study by the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy that surveyed 155 students in colleges and postgrad degrees in and around Delhi found that they roughly understood about half the privacy policy, and there was no meaningful difference between a law student and a non-law student. So these are texts that are not even decipherable to people who are studying law, which is a very interesting issue. Then if you look at the readability scores, you need graduate level readability to even read any of these. And for context, only some 8% of Indians are adult Indians are graduates. And if you look at the graph that we have on the right here, some of these privacy policies are actually more difficult to read in the Harvard Law Review. So we are trying to take these privacy policies and ask the average Indian to consent to them. So we're basically asking them to read something that's more difficult to read than the Harvard Law Review. And the cherry on the cake is of the 5 privacy policies that these set of researchers study, only 1 was available in any language except English. So while the website might have Hindi and other regional languages, which a lot of these companies have invested in, but they hadn't invested in, at least till 2018, in actually having their privacy policies in different languages. So this is broken. And I think it's a well accepted fact, but I think the study brought out some of the nuances of that. So what we then funded was, we funded how do you improve privacy? So what we did was we funded the Center for Social and Behavior Change at Ashoka University and the Busara Center for Economics to run a number of nudge experiments on data privacy and figure out how do you make privacy real for people. So they had about 5,500 participants across different cities of India with different income ranges. And they tested out about 20 odd different nudges, which can be categorized into 7 groups. This entire study is available online, but I will talk about the nudges that we saw actually worked. Because those are things that perhaps some folks in the audience can perhaps take and start thinking about a lot more. Firstly, what we found was, funnily, the thing that had the strongest impact on both comprehension as well as sharing of data was a mandatory cool down period. So if you forced people to be on the privacy policy for 6 minutes, they actually made the effort to go through it. They actually understood it better. But what was actually interesting was, after understanding it better, they were willing to share more data with the business that was asking for it. And this is a very interesting finding, because what that means is when people actually understand what they are consenting to, they feel more comfortable, they feel more trusting, and they are willing to share more data. So there is fundamentally a business case for privacy. The second finding was a star rating works very well. So with organizations that have a better star rating, and once consumers understand what that star rating stands for, a higher star rating both increases comprehension. Obviously, they probably don't understand the nitty-gritties, but they understand this is a more trustworthy platform, as well as sharing of data. So the more stars you have, the more data your consumers are willing to share with you, which again, I think is reiterates that business case for privacy. Of course, there's a lot to be thought about in terms of operationalizing this, who provides the rating, on what basis, etc. But as a as a concept, I think rating works quite well. And finally, we tested out a summary fact sheet, which is what happens when you break down that very long legalistic document into something that's visual, into something that's really simplified. And we saw that there was a statistically significant impact on the comprehension of people's privacy policies. So I think these were the three things that stood out in terms of having an impact on better comprehension of what people are consenting to. And then there were several nudges that, for example, awakened the privacy consciousness in them and made them share less data. So all of this information is available online, but I think the point I would reiterate is there's a lot to be done in terms of how you present and ask for consent, because that's how you truly empower individuals to be able to navigate it. And finally, what we at Omidyar Network are trying to do is also both keep track of as well as invest in a bunch of privacy tools that individuals can use to keep themselves safe. So, for example, there's a company called Doosra which provides a second virtual phone number. So the conceptual idea is, can you tokenize different parts of your identity and share those tokens with the service provider rather than your actual personal information? So Doosra has started doing that in terms of mobile numbers, but there might be other things like credit cards, etc., which can also be tokenized over time and improved. HTTPS Everywhere, which is an open source tool developed several years ago by the Electronic Freedom Frontier in the US, is also something that I personally use, and at least whenever you go onto a website, it tells you whether that website's communication is encrypted or not, which means you can keep away from websites that do not have good privacy practices, which do not protect your data adequately. Finally, a company that we have invested in, which is called CloudSec. It is a B2B threat intelligence provider, but one of the things it did was to create this open and free security search engine for mobile apps. So you can actually just go search for a particular app and get its security rating. You can understand whether their code is kosher or not, whether their data has been breached in the past or not. And for example, it found that about 0.5% of mobile apps on the internet, which cumulatively between them have about 100 million downloads, actually expose the AWS API keys on freely, which provides hackers a way to basically get a lot of sensitive data. And I've seen some of the demonstrations of this, and you can actually figure out people's financial transaction, and you can say on this app, this person paid 100 rupees to get this service, which is a very kind of blatant violation of people's privacy. So I think these are, of course, three examples of tools, some of which we have funded, which provide people the technological bearings to be able to get to a better privacy regime. But again, I would just take all of us back to this slide, which is to say that given that we know privacy is a dynamic concept, not a static concept, how do we really empower individuals to be able to navigate that? Of course, these findings are cross-cutting across different sectors, but equally relevant for digital financial services. So with that, I'll kind of stop my presentation and hand back to you, Sharon.
Thanks a lot, Shiva. This is very interesting, actually. I think we'll have a lot of questions on your nudge experiments. I was actually very keen on understanding the impact more on this. So I think now we can go through some of the questions that have been popping up on the chat. So one of the first questions here, and I think this is one that's a burning question. I think all of you, Jayshree, Gyaz, Indradip as well, can see the question. The first one seems to be a broad-based one. How can we create awareness and trust amongst all segments of people about digital financial services? So I think this is a loaded question with many dimensions. So I'll give it up to maybe everybody anybody wants to start to address this question from whatever angle you think promising to add to the discussion as well. Yeah. So I don't know who wants to first start tackling this question on trust and among the segments of people that are more marginalized and create awareness. I think those are the key things that emerge. Yeah.
Sorry, I can get started, Sharon, and share some of the ways we have approached this. So I think in general, awareness building in a country of India size is just a large and never finishing agenda, right? And what we have been therefore trying to do is to figure out what are the ways in which it is most effective. And the realization we had was that obviously different segments, different media, and also different vocabulary that you have to use. So for example, for people in what we call the next 500 million segment, who are kind of first-time internet users, we ran a radio show called Zindagi Mobile, which was 10 episodes, 10 minutes each, with kind of lots of music. And it reached about 10 million odd people across many different cities of India, and obviously targeted towards the kind of segment who listen to radio shows in kind of vernacular languages. We also got it behaviorally tested later, and we found that it had, for example, an impact on people's privacy consciousness or trust consciousness, which is they were thinking more about these aspects about, hey, are they asking for my data, are they not asking, etc. It also had an impact on their stated preference in terms of adopting new technologies. So I think radio storytelling is one area where we found a lot of success. It's a medium that obviously a lot of Indians listen to, and it's an extremely powerful one. Another one that we have tried to do is an initiative called Cyber Salamat, which is where the World Comics India, which is a non-profit registered in Delhi, they go to low-income communities, slum dwellers, etc., marginalized groups, and actually through comic book, kind of drawing out comic books, bring out their experiences with their data and what are the risks that they face and what are the frauds that they have experienced, etc. And kind of at the upper range of the spectrum, we have a social media, we have funded social media campaigns that we've kind of learned a lot of useful stuff. We have been thinking about how do you bring in some of this into school curriculum, etc. So all of that to say, I think there's a lot of kind of innovative communication strategies that can be used to ensure that the financial capital you spend behind these campaigns actually utilized in the best possible manner.
Great. Thanks, thanks a lot, Subhashish. Very helpful. Yeah. Jayashree, yeah.
I'm going to jump in because I think Subhashish laid out what one can do in terms of building capability. I mean, just to take a few steps back, I think it's also important to understand who's the segment. So, he's like you say, you develop radio programs, you develop, build it into school curriculum. But in each of those segments, it's also, you constantly speak about sub-segments of consumers. So women, for instance, might have unique needs when it comes to digital financial services. Their lives might be very different. And in building their capability or in building their awareness, I think it's important to be cognizant of some of these differences. So, for example, as you build the channel out, or as you build this delivery mechanism out, are you aware of the way they have access to their mobile phones? If that's a channel by which you're delivering. If you're delivering training programs, for instance. And I think COVID has helped push some of these innovations. So not in India, but in other parts of the world, in the HER project, for instance, we know that, BSR used video conferencing with remote trainers as well as animations when they had to train garment factory workers on where they could access G2P payments. We've seen examples where WhatsApp plays a huge role, and this is again not an Indian example, but in the Kenyan context, my favorite example is where this organization or this fintech started gathering gender disaggregated data, and they realized that their women consumers actually weren't completing the courses because they just had to break up their work schedule to go and do housework. And so they customized their course curriculum so that you could access it at any point and almost complete it flexibly. And that then led to higher completion rates. So I think there are a number of ways that digital allows that kind of customization and also access to who you're catering to and how you can almost, blend it with their lives. So yeah, just adding nuance to what Subhashish said.
Jayashree. Indra for Gyas, any thoughts on the big question on trust and awareness?
Yeah, so I just have to say that, get grievance right. And connect grievance, even conceptually, I find that this connection is not happening, even amongst people who are talking about, who are participating in this discourse, that connect grievance to consent. the whole discourse on consent is an ex ante discourse. It's all about, it's a legalistic discourse. Okay. But it really should also be, I'm not saying it should not be a legalistic ex ante discourse, but it should also be an ex post grievance discourse. Grievance and consent have to be connected, so that if grievance is not effective and if it is not timely, then consent is illegitimate. Consent can be illegitimate on a whole set of ex ante grounds, but consent is also illegitimate, I feel, if you are not getting grievance correct. So get grievance correct, I would say, is absolutely essential to engendering trust. The other thing, one thing I will take a little bit of issue with is, Shubhashish, it's with something you said, which is that there is a business case for protection, for risk protection, for customer protection. See, I'm skeptical, because if there were a business case, it would already be happening. Entrepreneurs are smart. If there is a, and I'll make a slightly academic point here. So, there is a paper written by Kenneth Arrow in 1963, which is a health economy, which basically this paper inaugurates the field of health economics. And in this paper, Arrow seeks to understand how a patient can begin to trust the doctor, and so this doctor-patient relationship, and how can one engender trust in that relationship. And Arrow says something very, very remarkable. He actually points out that there is no economic case for creating trust between the doctor and the patient. And when he says this, he says that, the very word profit signals a denial of the trust relations. So the idea that, I'm going to create trust so that I can profit, and therefore that there is a business case for creating trust, I find fundamentally problematic. So I just want to say that I think this question of, is there a business case, in fact, for creating trust or creating an ethic of responsibility? It's a complex question. It's not a question that I think we have fully unpacked. And certainly, I have not seen the economics of digital financial services laid out anywhere. And obviously, because I have not seen the economics of digital financial services laid out anywhere, I have not seen any representation of the cost it would create for a provider to put in place all of these mechanisms for protection and adequate redressal of grievance. And therefore, if that would indeed be commercially viable or not.
Thanks, Indra. That's very insightful. Are there any examples from the work? I know Bara has been doing work on informed consent and trust. Are there or those insights come from some of the early, insights that you're getting, early work?
Yeah. So, sorry, did you ask me that question, Sharon?
I asked you because I know Bara has been looking onto these trust issues and some of the informed consent work.
Yeah. So we are doing some work on consent in particular, and it's still ongoing. We are trying to figure out what an optimal consent artifact might look like. And I think here I would borrow from things that both Jayeshi and Subhashish have said, which is that if you can make consent, consent doesn't have to always be in textual form. Consent can be gained in other forms. So we are playing around with these ideas. How can we make consent not lengthy? How can we make consent not text heavy? How can we make the privacy notice less technical? These are, how can you design consent for feature phones, for instance? These are some of the questions that we are tackling in our own research. I can't say that we have conclusive results to share with you at this point, but this is something that continues to engage us. But I do want to say that our thinking also takes this view, which is that you have to link grievance to consent. Conceptually, that link, I feel that the discourse is failing to make.
Thanks a lot. Go ahead, Jayeshi.
No, I totally agree with that. I mean, and also the elephant in the room is choice, right? We can provide access to consent. We can provide ways in which easy comprehension is possible. We can define redressal mechanisms. But, you know, is the person that's accessing this service really doing it because they have choice, or because you know, they have to? Do they have the freedom to walk away? In many cases, that's not the case. So, so that, of course, is a huge problem that we need to solve.
Thanks, Jayashree. There's a lot of questions, so I'm just going to put, there's one question that's interesting, and that's probably from the researchers here. How does one measure trust? Because it's elusive, it's dynamic, but
Yeah.
how do we measure progress on trust? So I don't know if someone can take the lead on that one as well, because I think those are another loaded question.
Well, you know, well, if I can just add a layer of complexity, another layer of complexity on that. So trust is actually, when we say trust is dynamic, we're actually saying trust is a verb. It's not a noun. So how do you measure action? You can't, I think that, I mean, you know, this, I mean, there are certain things that I think we should accept our incapacity to measure, but that is not to say that we do not know when trust is active, let's say. I think it is possible to know when trust is active. It is possible to know when trust has lapsed. But you know, and I suppose that's what the question is asking, which is in which case, I mean, it's a very, very good question. But I think repeated interactions with a provider is one possible measure, because trust is a verb. Therefore, it is something that develops through repeated successful satisfactory interactions that the customer has with the FSP, financial service provider, is, I would say, a primary metric one could use to measure the build-up of trust. And trust is also something I feel that it takes a long time to actually build up, but it takes very little to break. So it's asymmetric in that way. You know, that once the trust is broken, it might take a long period before the customer can become trusting of the FSP again.
Thanks, Indra. That's very insightful. So I'll change topic a bit because a lot of the questions are pouring very interesting. There is a series of questions for Ghias where people want to understand a little bit more on this redressal mechanism. I think you alluded to like aspects of supervision, data protection officer, external dispute resolution, creating credible threat of enforcement. People want to have there's a question on better sense of responsibility of supervisors in this context, especially I think the case in India. You know, credible threat of enforcement is difficult. There's low capacity for supervision. And another related question is that the government has done a lot of initiative, but as well, how can the private sector also do initiative, be players? And given, like Indra mentioned, there is a sort of like a link between, you know, private sector players are smart, no? They also look at profit and, you know, and I don't think they intend to do bad, but in a sense, you know, there is this complex aspects to it. So if you can address those, you know, supervision issues, what is the private sector can do? How can the government better, you know, supervise? And as well, I had another question when you were discussing is that these are all interesting suggestions, but who bears the cost of a data protection officer? How does it, because those transactions are things that on paper, they're very nice, but when you try to put it in practice, that's where it really sticks in a sense, when things are in no man's land. But it's almost like a natural equilibrium where, you know, you're better off if everybody does it, but if nobody starts it first, then how can you? So this is a loaded question to you, yes, based on some of the, I tried to combine a few questions that were addressed to you, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. And I think this question is also linked to the very insightful discussion that we've been having on linking grievance and consent and what manifests trust actually. Again, from a policy perspective, there are two things two approaches actually. First is the carrot and stick approach, wherein as a regulator, you have deterrent one of the deterrents that you have in place is if the complaints are not addressed, if the redressal mechanism is not in place, or if there is a lapse in any of the compliance requirements and all, the penalties are such that they act as deterrent to the licensed entities. So this is the classic case of this is the GDPR regulations in the EU, which they kind of have 4% of the revenues as a penalty for not complying with the GDPR regulations, so on and so forth. So a carrot and stick approach, but as I've been mentioning, taking a proportionate approach to this actually, and this links to your third point. Will every licensed entity be able to have a data protection officer? Will every entity be able to do data audits and assessments on a periodic basis, so on and so forth? The answer for that is no. So that's why we have to take a gradual and a proportionate approach. So as a company grows or as a organization grows, and as they start processing more information, and as the level of confidentiality and sensitivity of the information that is being processed grows, that's when incrementally these compliance requirements should grow. So first is the carrot and stick approach. The second is the naming and shaming approach, wherein again, some of the countries, I recall Brazil doing this quite effectively. So what they do is they collect all the complaints that they receive on a periodic basis and put it up in on their website on a quarterly basis. So these are and they classify, so they slice and dice the information based on the size of the financial service provider, based on the type of complaints that were received, and number of complaints received, so on and so forth. They slice and dice the information and put it up on the website. And then now the media picks it up and names and shames the organizations that have received highest number of complaints or not addressed these complaints, so on and so forth, and kind of positively nudges these licensed entities to act on the complaints and grievances that they have been receiving. On the private sector players, and what is the skin in the game for them to be, to have privacy incorporated in their business processes and all. I think I think we have to look at it in a rather holistic manner, and again, the objective of coming up with regulations and setting the rules of the game is to kind of eliminate fly-by-night operators. Most of the service providers are the services that they provide are not with the intention of disproportionately gaining from the consumer, but there are fly-by-night operators. So again, the role of self-regulating organizations, industry associations is also very important in addressing issues related to data protection and privacy. And this is already happening in many of the emerging market economies and as well as developed economies. There are the fintech associations, the industry associations, self-regulatory organizations that are coming in and setting up principles and codes of conduct in terms of the usage and processing of data before the regulator even comes in. Actually, yeah. This is again a very good step towards building that credibility and trust, not only with the consumers but with the regulator and the broader ecosystem, I guess. So I'll stop there by saying that in the long run, it's beneficial for a fintech or a service provider to make it mutually beneficial in terms of usage and processing of data. Actually, thank you.
Sharon, if I may just add something,
Yes.
I would very heartily second what Ghyas has said about the professional associations and the role that they can play in driving standards. Because if we can agree that this is an ethical problem and take it, and then the code of professional ethics is important, and we cannot depend on individual private sector actors to voluntarily adopt a code of ethics because they want to be ethical. Rather, it is the industry associations, and I would also add to that list impact investors. I think impact investors, venture capitalists, and industry associations can play a huge role in cultivating an ethic of responsibility among digital financial service providers. And of course, supervisors and regulators are required, but they will always be late to the game, so to speak.
Thanks a lot, Indradip. Any other, Shubhashish or Jayashree, any comment on this aspect?
I mean, if I could come in, I do slightly disagree with Indradeep, and I think that's good, right? In a panel discussion without disagreement is probably no discussion at all. So I think Indradeep did ask a pertinent question, which is, look, if there is a business case for privacy, why hasn't it already happened? And again, I would kind of take us back to Econ 101, which is markets fail when there's asymmetric information. So the problem with the privacy market is not so much that yes, the evidence is mixed, as Indradeep says. I think there's reason to believe there is a market and there isn't a market, or there is a business case and not. But fundamentally, we will also never know because there is asymmetric information. As a user, what do I even know who's offering me better privacy, and what is better privacy is also an unanswered question. So I'm not as pessimistic on it. Again, I'm not a DFS specialist. My work is in the data protection space, but I see enough and more evidence that there is enough to investigate there in terms of the business case of privacy. So if you look at the economic literature, you see that at least in the short term, there is a statistically significant negative impact on stock prices, but because of data breaches. So obviously there is for data protection, in that case, a business case. If you see adoption of new technologies like electronic health records, again, evidence from interstate difference in the US shows that better privacy regulation actually does lead to higher adoption of EHRs. And really in our kind of everyday day-to-day practice, now we have a big tech company like Apple standing up and saying, hey, look, I am the privacy person. We have seen a very marked shift from WhatsApp to Signal. For a while, Signal was the most downloaded app in India. So these are all signals that make me feel optimistic about it. But yes, I think there is obviously reason to not be overtly optimistic or simplistic about this trend as Indradeep warns us.
Thanks a lot, Shubhashish. So we have some less than 10 minutes, so 9 minutes left. There's a lot of questions, but I think a lot of them summarize. There's an interesting question that summarizes a bit the others is looking at sort of like if implementing enterprise risk management principles in fintech companies help looking at data protection apart from grievance, consent, regulatory compliance, like they do for the more established financial institutions. So it's comparing fintech with financial institutions on enterprise management risk. And there's another question that's almost related to that, is also the misinformation. So even if people give consent, are people ultimately utilizing the right information to base their decision on? So it's a little bit, it's above safeguarding data privacy. It's safeguarding, make sure that people arrive, at the right information and not further exclude people based on some data you get. Because you often see, for example, fintech applications can be used by any people of the household, even if we think the men are using it. So the housewife might have an application or a service, but someone else in the household is driving that behavior, and people utilize data. So it's a sort of like a combined question that I'm trying to put together for the last 10 minutes. So if we can do a round, that'd be great. Yeah. Anybody want to start on this one? Yeah.
So I can jump in because we've done a lot of work on biases, and some of I think what you're alluding to is that there are biases in the real world, and particularly because when you speak about DFS, which is non-physical, and there's just a mobile phone or some other interface to deal with, we don't really know where they're drawing data from. So there's one set of risks comes from the fact that in the real world or in the physical world, there are biases already. There are norms that are followed within households, and then those get translated into the digital world. The second set of biases that emerge are because it's just the kind of data that's being picked up by forms or by algorithms that then process it just may not be consistent and might be coming from quite disparate data trails. And so that creates a whole new set of risks, because are you really assessing for what you think you're assessing versus, the reality? So I think that, those are the two sets of risks that I see. And of course, in the digital world, everything gets amplified much more than the physical world. Does that answer what you were?
Yeah, thanks, Jayashree. That's actually very insightful, because it looks at maybe a dimension above and beyond just the safeguard is once people have given from how responsible are we using for this data. Because a lot of people, a lot of low-income segments are being into the more financial aspect and getting their data utilized. So at the end of the day, it's understanding how we want to empower people to manage their data at the end of the day, understanding and how they aware that how their data will be utilized in a sense. So probably if biases are already introduced and say, it would be important for you to use your application because the data would relate on your behavior or something like that, that could be quite interesting to see. Any other insights on this aspect? Else we can take one other small question after on another aspect. I think there's another question for Giaz as well on examples of other countries on regulatory framework. If there's no more questions on answers on this one, yeah.
On regulatory frameworks related to data protection and privacy,
Yeah, in other countries, examples where they might be more advanced in India. Probably the context might be different, but what are, from your perspective, since you presented an international aspect to your presentation?
So in my presentation, I did say that around 65% of the countries that are part of the UN system already have a legal framework on data protection. But some of the countries, from an advanced country perspective, the GDPR and the California Consumer Protection Act, these two are there. But beyond the advanced economies, and Australia is also a good example when it comes to regulations and legal frameworks around data protection. From the emerging market economies, East African countries are slightly ahead in the game. So Kenya is one of the countries. They introduced data protection frameworks this year. Rwanda is also there. South Africa, Central Bank of Nigeria already has. From Latin America, Mexico and Brazil has a data protection framework that could be. And Brazil's data protection framework is again very recent, and they have studied and taken the best parts from the Europe's GDPR and California's data privacy acts. From the region, Malaysia, where I'm based, has data protection legal framework, but that does not, in my personal opinion, reflect the actual realities in the financial services space. But Singapore has a very good data protection framework in place, and it also a good thing about Singapore's data protection framework is it also provides practical tools and templates for the licensed entities to refer to actually. So if they have to conduct a data privacy risk assessment, or if they have to conduct data audits, or if they have to come up with standard business processes that are compliant with the data privacy requirements, they have developed the conditions, the templates themselves for the licensed entity to refer to. Philippines is another good example. Again, the issue of digital lending and naming and shaming of the relatives, friends and relatives, or the delinquent debtors is a common thing happening in Philippines, as we see in India recently. So the Data Protection Authority in the Philippines has issued a strong guidance around that. specifically related to digital lending and data privacy implications of that. So these are some of the examples of countries that have a framework in place. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Yes. I think our time is up. We just have a few minutes. I want to thank Access for this opportunity. As well, thank the panelists. I think we can talk for a long time. There is, for the viewers, there are a series of questions I think that are still there. If anybody can send emails to us, I think the people from Access can forward it to us. Happy to provide answers to that. Before ending, I just wanted to do one last, in 2 sentences on each of the panelists, if they can mention what is the biggest challenge that can be addressed right away, or the need of the hour in terms of like this digital innovation and safeguard as well. So just as per your thoughts, 2 sentences or something like that to close on this session. Yeah. So maybe I can start in the order it started. Maybe Indradeep, then Jayashree, then Gyas, and then Subhashish.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. Thanks for hosting and moderating this discussion. And thank you to all my fellow panelists as well for a rich discussion. Certainly learned a lot. And Gyas, if you can share that deck, that'd be great. I might write to you separately for it. Sharon, I would say get grievance redress right. Get it right, because without effective and timely grievance redress, we're not going to get much traction with DFS.
Thanks, Indradeep. Yeah. Jayashree? Yeah.
So I want to echo Indradeep's thoughts. So thank you for the opportunity, and wonderful meeting all the panelists. So I mean, I think I'm going to try and tackle two birds with one stone, which is I think the regulator should start looking at complaints from a sex disaggregated lens. And I think that will not only solve the problem of grievance redressal, but also the fact that India has one of the worst gender gaps in financial services. So the fact that we're not getting enough complaints is a proxy for very few women are using the service, or very few women are complaining. And I think that will unpack a whole bunch of other issues. So that could be an area of priority.
Thanks, Jayashree. Very insightful. I'll go to Gyas. Yeah.
Thanks again for inviting me. It was a pleasure to talk to you. To answer to the question, I think it goes back to the point that Indradeep made. Regulators are always in a catch-up game. Maybe that's the default structure of the ecosystem. Innovators are there to innovate, and regulators are there to regulate, but in a catch-up mode. So probably the rules of the game, the principles, the conduct of the players should be defined by themselves first, in order for them to come across as more credible and trustworthy, and then gradually regulators should step in once they observe and learn from the innovations happening in the ecosystem. Thank you.
Thanks, Gyas. And lastly, Subhashish.
Yeah, I think what we should be doing is setting up the infrastructure for better privacy, both technologically in terms of tools for controlling data, but also infrastructure in terms of standards that people, or bridging these information asymmetries and having some kind of rating system and that kind of stuff. So I think the government, regulators, and associations should be focusing on setting up these kind of tech and knowledge and standard infrastructure.
Great. Thanks, Subhashish. I think we a little bit 2 minutes for my time. So thank you a lot. Over to you, and thank everybody. Have a nice day and wonderful session. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you,
Sharon. Thank you all the panelists for what has been a truly exciting discussion today. The flood of questions we received today is testimony to how exciting and thought-provoking the sessions were. So thank you, Jayashree. Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. Thank you, Subhashish, and thank you, Ghyasuddin. And a special round of thanks to you, Sharon, for so deftly steering the conversation today. Thank you once again. So we will end the session now. And before ending the session, I will just like to also thank all the delegates who have joined us for the discussion today online. We will have a short break of around 7 minutes, and we'll be back at 12:50 p.m. in the same hall. The next session is on mass market digital lending, emerging trends and perspectives. So thank you once again, everyone.
Thanks.